Hey there, friends. This is Bill MacDonald, the ELAR Right Prescription Doctor. I'm here in my pretend kitchen wanting to share some real questions with you from the 2021 spring end of course editing portion. One little passage that gave the 10th graders some fits this past spring. And the next three videos, including this one, are going to be solely about punctuation. Three out of the four questions in the passage that we're exploring today had problems that were the P of cups or the sentence boundary issues of run-ons and fragments. So when I saw the mistakes, it made me want to go to the what we call the TEKs from the state so that I could see which grade levels were accountable for which types of punctuation. And remember that if a sixth grade student has to learn something about punctuation, then that means that all seventh, eighth, ninth, and 10th graders have to also be held accountable to remember that punctuation rule, even if it's not mentioned in that grade level. So, what I noticed, each grade level had a few different keywords mentioned in terms of what was needing to be taught in that grade level from all of secondary, basically, from sixth grade to 10th grade. So let me show you that real quick. I'm gonna put on my glasses so that I can see what I'm talking about. Click advanced in my Zoom content from a second document camera and share. And so what I did to kind of make it easy, I put them all on 2 pages. For sixth grade, as you can see, I highlighted it. One of the punctuations says commas, complex sentences, transitions, introductory elements. So I'm going to focus very quickly on complex sentences. A complex sentence is a sentence that starts with a capital and has a dependent clause followed by a comma and an independent clause with no capital unless that first word after the comma is a proper noun, and then a punctuation. What is uh, complex? That means it's a um, dependent clause and an independent clause. Transitions, whenever we're moving from one part of something to the next, we'll learn that. And introductory elements is the other thing I want to focus on. An introductory phrase is a uh, who, what, when, where, how, which. If I tell you to start with how, which, where, oh, when, you have to put a comma then. You often put a comma then. To start with how, which, where, oh, when, you often put a comma then. So, not with those words, but if you start with something that means that, for example, if I tell you, last night I ate a huge pickle. Last night is my introductory phrase, but because it's so short, I don't need to put a comma because there's an unwritten rule that says on short phrases that you can omit the comma if you want to, and that's happened a few times on the state where the passage had uh, the a sentence with a short introductory phrase that had a comma, and when it was moved over to the questions, it didn't have the comma because in short introductory phrases, the commas are optional. So, what about a when? Let me add some words to it so you can see the difference. Last night around 10 o'clock. That's a when, last night around 10 o'clock, a when, last night around 10 o'clock, because that phrase is longer, then you would typically want to put a comma there to separate and from the when from who or what is doing that thing at that time. Where in the corner I noticed uh, humongous black widow. In the corner only has 3 words, so I don't necessarily have to put a comma. I can, but I don't have to. In the corner of the room by my window. In the corner is a where, of my room is a where, and by my window is where. When you're done with all of the wheres, you can put a comma, because that introductory phrase that just tells me where something is longer, and so you would want to put a comma there. So that's basically a crash course on how to introduce in 6th grade complex sentences and introductory phrases. In 7th grade, the new thing that they add is semicolons. A semicolon is just a punctuation that slows the sentence down, that says, we told you something in an independent clause first. We're going to call it the shirt. And then we have a belt called a semicolon. There's going to be another independent clause, but it's not going to be capitalized. Now, coordinating conjunctions, which are mentioned in 4th grade and up, have 2 independent clauses joined together by a comma and what many of you call fanboys, a coordinating conjunction, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So in 7th grade, your students have to be aware of when they can add a semicolon or when they need to remove one whenever there's not 2 independent clauses. So if your shirt is the first independent clause in the semicolon sentence, then your semicolon would be your belt and your pants would be the other independent clause, but you wouldn't need to put a capital on the first word after the semicolon. Now, probably because students need to see the difference, this is kind of corny, but my colon is in the middle of my body because a colon and a semicolon will be in the middle of my sentence. And that's why I use my belt. Right below my belt is a part of our anatomy called our colons, which means slow down, but there's going to be something else. So a colon says, it's going to be talked about in the next grade. A colon is 2 dots that are vertical, one above the other, that say we have an independent clause for the shirt, then we have a colon, and which is followed by something, an example of what we're talking about in the first sentence, or a list. So we have to learn how to use semicolons in 7th grade and substitute, move back and forth between coordinating conjunctions and semicolons and knowing the difference. If we switch over to 8th grade, we have to know how to use a comma in a non-restrictive phrase or clause. Okay, that and which. That's one example. A lot of times which is used, and whenever which is just talking about whatever was mentioned first, that's called a non-restrictive clause. Whenever the word that is used, it's all inclusive. It means everything, and so that would be a restrictive. And I'll get into detail with that a little bit more in one of the videos. But as you can see here, your kids have to know semicolons and colons once they get to 8th grade. And so many of you who are reading teachers need to be aware that your students can and most likely will be tested on colons, semicolons, and non-restrictive commas, which are sort of all-inclusive in terms of what they're talking about. And like I said, I'll get into more of that later. In grade 9, English 1, it says commas, semicolons, colons, and dashes. Your kids are going to have to know how to use a dash to set off phrases and clauses as appropriate. And so make sure that whenever you see that in reading, that you do teachable moments of instruction and tell your kids you need to learn how to do that in writing as well, because in ninth grade and higher, they can and possibly will be tested on it. In 10th grade, it's punctuation again, commas, semicolons, colons, dashes, and parentheses. And so they're kind of building on what they started in. So to set off phrases, so parentheses kind of is sort of like giving you an example of whatever you're talking about inside the context of the sentence. So make sure that you know that anything that's mentioned in the grades before yours can and most likely will be tested on. So as we get straight to question 16, this one got 65% correct. The answer had to do with taking out a semicolon. And as a quick review, I said that you use a semicolon this way, where you have a capital, a word that starts with a capital, which is an independent clause, a sentence that has a subject and a predicate, followed by a semicolon. Think of yellow, slowing the sentence down, followed by another independent clause. And because it's not followed by another independent clause, it starts with the word because, then that can't work. And you're going to see here that it would work with a semicolon if you take out because and put it provides. So let's take a look. We read the question, we underlined and labeled the question, we evaluated the question, executed our strategies. So we're going to read, underline, and label inside the passage just sentence 10. Remember that we said if the question says change, you'll underline change and you'll label the word cups. Letter F said change use to using. And you have to check and see what the subject is. Since the subject is scientists, that's plural. Scientists use, scientists using. The only way you could use using, and we'll see that in there when we look at it, is if you add the word are, and it doesn't have that. So we can't say scientists using. We have to say scientists are using. So we would eliminate that word. Both of those words are real. So it's not a spelling issue. It's which one would you use in the context of that sentence for subject-verb agreement. Delete the semicolon, remove it, in other words. That's a punctuation mistake, and we'll see that in a second why we're going to delete the semicolon and start a comma after standard. That's a punctuation mistake, and because there is a mistake and we see it, we're not going to pick letter J. So let's take a look at sentence 10, and you'll see that I highlighted sentence 10 to make sure that your students can see it well. I went ahead and put brackets, and somebody asked me once, why do you use brackets instead of underlining? Well, since editing has to do with punctuation as well, if I draw a line underneath these, what's going to happen is it's possible that that comma there and the period would get covered up by the underlining mark. And so I suggest that you have opening brackets and closing brackets, or that you highlight, or that you do both. And so one thing you can do is plug in the letters. F says to do something here, G says something there. What does H say or J say? And we'll check that. J said no mistake, and so we'll put out here J and M, no mistake. So let's go ahead and read it out loud. Keep in mind that when your kids test solo, they're testing by themselves. But when I train students to read, solo means let's read LO loudly when we're doing it as a class or in groups, or softly when we're working with a partner or by myself on the test, because I want to be able to hear what this sentence sounds like. I'm going to open my ears and hear and listen. I'm going to open my eyes and see the sentence while I'm opening my mouth and saying the sentence. So let me go ahead and show you, because this is punctuation related. I'm going to go ahead and verbalize the punctuation marks. There's a comma there, there's a semicolon, and a period. And so think of all punctuation marks as circles that are kind of like little balls that you would bounce in different places. Capital, for example, comma. It's an introductory phrase. United States U.S. scientists use the metric system exclusively, semicolon. So that means we should see an independent clause coming up, because it provides a standard that is understood worldwide. Since we're that of that word, because of that word, because it makes this part dependent on something that should be coming. Because you're such a good friend of mine, I'm going to buy you a nice gift. So you can't have a semicolon when you're joining this part over here with this part over here. Like I mentioned, if we just were to write, it provides, watch how that would sound. Sentence 10, sorry about that. For example, U.S. scientists use the metric system exclusively. Take out that word. It provides a standard that is understood worldwide. It is the metric system. That becomes my subject of the second sentence. So just by taking out that word because, it would make the semicolon possible, but we can't leave it in there because of the word because. Okay, so we're going to delete that semicolon, shirt, pants, because of this word right here. And let's check and see. It said insert a comma after standard. Let's see why we would not do that. It provides a standard that is understood worldwide. Since the standard is that which we are talking about, we wouldn't need to separate these with a comma. And so that's where you need to know the difference between restrictive and non-restrictive commas, because in that situation we don't need a comma to separate. So that's how I would do number 16. And again, keep in mind that if you have a test that you're taking in April and only 65% of the students in Texas got it correct, that means 1 out of every 3 kids didn't understand the rules involving a semicolon. So we have to practice that enough, do a lot of extended practice where you have a shirt independent sentence followed by another independent sentence, and you're going to remove the capital of the pants and make sure that both sentences have a subject and a predicate, and they're only going to be joined by a semicolon with lowercase on the second part, the pants part. And it's sort of like what you would do with comma with the fanboys, except you wouldn't have the comma or the fanboys if you're using a semicolon. So please share this video. I hope that you click like on my YouTube page. Subscribe if you're not already subscribing. That's a free video strategies. I can't send you this test. You have to kind of go in yourself using the student or parent or teacher portal and kind of check out the test. The 4th grade and 7th grade writing won't be available until the 28th. And then in August, mid to late August, the state will release the tests so that you can see printed forms of them. So I'm just trying to do my best to make sure that you can see strategies and not have to wait all the way till school starting to help your students with editing, because 3rd through 8th grade are going to have some field tested items of editing and revising this coming year in isolated passages. and ninth and 10th grade will continue to have them 9 questions each in isolated passages. And the ninth and 10th grade have 5 hours. So if I were to guess, if they're turning the reading into an English language arts test that includes editing and revising and eventually, excuse me, some open-ended short answer, then they're probably going to allow 3rd through 8th grade students to have 5 hours as well, because you're going to be having more content that you're going to have to be able to read and understand and work through. So please share or tag one of your writing teacher friends in secondary, because those kids need to understand when to use semicolons and when to remove them. Thanks and God bless.